Welcome to the INBLF Great Legal Minds Series, a global look at COVID-19 and trade. I'm honored to be able to introduce you briefly to our three expert panelists. And actually, Larry indicated that they would give more detailed information about their firms, but I just want to let you know that our speaker from China is Ye Li. He's a partner in the Albright in China, and of course, he's our China member partner. We have, in Europe, we have Sebastiaan Moolenaar from AKD Netherlands, and he will be speaking on issues that are going on not only in the Netherlands, but in Europe. So welcome. And in the United States, we have Lawrence, or we know him as Larry Friedman, and he is also, he's at Barnes, Richardson, and Colburn LLP, and he is also one of the other trade experts, along with Ye Li and Sebastiaan, that are going to give you a brief introduction about what is going on globally regarding trade in this very trying times of COVID-19. So I'll give the stage over to our expert panelists now. Larry, would you like to moderate and introduce the rest of the panelists and get the panel going?
Sure, happy to do that. Thanks, Marcy, and thanks, Jane, for arranging all of this and for everybody participating. I did notice from the gallery view, I've got, I think half of my partners are online and a couple of associates, so you guys will keep me honest if anything goes astray. So why don't we start with Ye Li? You want to introduce yourself and then give us the view from China, what's happening with respect to COVID-19 and with respect to trade with the rest of the world.
Sure. Hi, this is Ye Li. I'm working at the Beijing office of Albright. My focus is on trade, international trade, trade remedy, trade regulation, custom, etc. So I will go straightforward following the outline and to share some views in the perspective of China. It's already been a couple of months going on here in China. There is a lot of pain, lots of abnormality and going on here. But now, fortunately, after all of this, all the business in China reopened. So we're almost back to the normal, but still there is certain area, there is a new cases coming. So the government is ready to implement certain restrictive measures to cope with it. But in general, all the restrictions of personnel and goods movement were removed. So personally, I'm already back to traveling. So that's good. And as the law firm, we also get back. However, a certain working mode during the virus outbreak continues, like a work from home, flexible working time to avoid the crowds and rush hours, and also the non-essential business traveling still not allowed by our firm. And also the marketing activities like seminar, conference are not allowed. Even the partnership meeting is not this year. In June will not be face to face, but through video conference. So still, people are very cautious getting back to normal. With the hope that everything can finally going to the right direction. Now in China, the biggest problem still is the international traveling. Traveling abroad is still not possible because of the travel bans, and also any travelers into China mandatory quarantine 14 days. So basically, all the international travels have been suspended. So it is a challenge to uh, provide a service to overseas international clients, in particular for some work have to be done on spot. For instance, I did a lot of I always did this kind of work on site, but now it's not possible. So we have to work out a way to work remotely. That's a big challenge. Well, hopefully, after a couple of months, the international travels can resume. And during this period, there is we see increasing number of demand in terms of litigation and arbitration. Um, Also, bankruptcy, restructure, financing bond, also regulation and compliance. Probably because the economy is going down, the industries and the prices are lack of cash flow. So there is a lot of disputes due to breach of contract, the failure of, like construction and enterprises go to bankruptcy, so they need financing, they need the issue of bonds. That brings a lot of work. But unfortunately, because of the capability, the financial situation for these clients, so in general, it's very common that the clients request a discount of legal fees. 15% is very normal. We have to work with the clients with to accept the discounts during this hard period of time. And the other area like MA, IPO, banking, all of this area, we see a decreasing demand. And that's I think is common in light of the economy is going down. Concerning the operation of the courts and government is they are no they are working with the flexibility, and it's fortunate that this in China normally the courts, including the and as well as the arbitration institution and government agencies, are very reluctant to change their manner of working, but due to the virus outbreak, so they have to change. So the electronic filing service, video conference for exchange of evidence or hearing are very common and more acceptable than before. And also the deadlines, schedules were postponed, and all the non-essential face-to-face meetings were canceled. But in general, people are trying to find a way to work out. That's good. I think the change of the working manner will go beyond outbreak. So in the future, we can see the courts and arbitration institutions and government agencies will have some takeaway, from this outbreak. So they may we see more flexibility and change in the manner of their working. That's in general we see is a positive development from this crisis. Okay, the next issue is concerning the export control and restrictive measures on the PPE supply. This is a big dispute, big issue in China because at the beginning, everywhere is short of supply and there is a chaos and lots of problem with the supply of PPE, and there is a regulation issue, quality issue in general, and also logistics failure. So and after the capacity of production comes back, and the regulation comes into play. So there is a blacklist and a whitelist in China for exports of PPE products. Blacklist is it is a list of enterprises with the records of wrongdoings, has been punished or determined to be violation of law by market supervision authorities. So all the enterprises in the blacklist are prohibited from exporting PPE products. So this is a blacklist. And second is whitelist. Whitelist is a list of enterprises which were verified by the chamber the chamber for medicine and pharmaceutical products in China. These enterprises were verified to have the certification of exports. For instance, the FDA certification for the US markets and the CE certification for the European markets. So the customer authority will release the goods of the enterprises in the whitelist. So this is a whitelist and blacklist to monitor and control the exports. I would take the blacklist and whitelist is not as restrictive measures, but as the quality control measures to ensure that there will not be any compliance problem in the PPE supply. But in general, still the regulation and logistic failure is a big challenge now for many Chinese suppliers, producers. It's their concern. And as far as I know, all the big manufacturers of PPE products are running at full capacity, and it is a seller market, and it's still short of supply in the market. But production may not be the necessary the bottleneck, but the regulation and logistic failure are the bottlenecks. Finally, I want to share the view that from this crisis, I think the industries are rethinking about the supply chain and the sales market, and because obviously the stability of the supply chain has been placed as a priority, taken more serious than before, and also the diversity of the sales market. The conflict between the US and China, as well as the crisis, the virus crisis, so push people to rethink the safety the stability of their supply and sales market, and this leads to also bring the change to the demand for legal services. And as far as the area I'm working on, I see after the reopening of economy in many countries, there could be more trade restrictive measures because the competition between the industries in different countries will getting very intense. So the industry will think about applying or petition for restricted border measures like tariff, anti-dumping, anti-subsidy measures to protect its interests. And we already see many countries which were not that active but are becoming very active in trade measures like Chile, like Ukraine, like Korea. I think this trend will be going on, in particular in the second half of this year. There will be more trade investigation, in particular trade remedies, anti-dumping, and anti-countervailing investigations. So that's all I want to share with all of you, and thank you, Larry, for your invitation.
Well, thanks for that. Why don't we, we'll go through the presentations and we'll stay time after all three of us to do some questions. So Sebastiaan, you want to tell us what's going on in the Netherlands and in Europe?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Yali, for very interesting observations from China. Let me share the dramatic situation in Europe at the moment, at least from an economic perspective. Because obviously COVID-19 has a huge impact on the economic situation, whereby also there is a bit of an unfortunate imbalance in economic downturn when you look at the various member states. There are differences, huge differences. And actually, when summing up what the situation is, I found the 2020 outlook, which was presented by the European Commissioner for Economic Affairs. And I think he put in a few bullet points quite aptly the situation as it is now. The Union has entered the deepest economic recession in its history. That's basically what it is. The economy is expected to contract by a record 7.4% this year, almost 8% in the Eurozone, because as you might know, not every European member state is part of the Eurozone. So we're almost at 10% minus this year. And the recession and also the expected partial recovery will be uneven because there are considerable differences between the member states. I mean, all member states are forecast to endure severe recession this year. But if you look at which countries are going to be hit the most, it will be Greece, Italy, Spain, and also to a lesser extent, France. And as you might know, amongst the largest member state, Italy was struck first by the virus and also most forcefully, and their economy is to contract by about 10%. And Italy is still a huge economic factor, especially from a manufacturing point of view. So that's a very bad situation. And you see a difference, which was already there from the beginning, but the gap is widening between the north and the south, basically, in Europe. And that is getting more and more obvious because of the situation as it is now. Obviously, we will have consumer prices expected to fall. There's a sharp weakening in consumer demand, steep fall in oil prices as well. So that is a thing that we can see, but that will be, I think, all over the world. Unemployment will increase. There are very serious policy measures, both on the European level and on national levels throughout the Union that should limit the rise of unemployment. But still, it is expected to increase to about 9 to 10% overall this year. And of course, behind the unemployment rate, there is a massive drop in actual hours worked because people businesses are getting support from the government not to let off people, so they are technically still employed, but not working at all, or working much less. It's interesting to see that as these things go in Europe, we have the European institutions which try to coordinate things, but many measures are taken at a national level. So you have European governments inventing similar wheels all the time. Still, though, I should say that most governments have reacted quite decisively by implementing various state aid programs and fiscal measures just aimed at limiting social and economic damage. But obviously, these measures come at a price. Public debt will rise considerably this year. Deterioration of public finances to be expected in all member states. Just look at the state guarantees for loans for businesses and other liquidity support. That's 22% of the GDP in Europe. So we're talking about massive amounts here to support businesses survive and to keep people employed in order not to make things worse. But overall, there is serious economic uncertainty because economic activity really dropped overnight. Supply down, industrial output down, investment down, trade and capital down, and of course government consumption way up. Of course, how it works and how it will continue to develop, we will just have to see. There is some recovery at the moment because the government imposed measures are relaxed somehow, but not evenly throughout the member state, not evenly in the sectors, because there are still serious restrictions in tourism and recreational and cultural activities. And of course, we have the summer holidays coming up. So again, the countries I just mentioned, like Spain and France and Greece and Italy, will be hit because they're very dependent on tourism. And it remains to be seen whether travel, if at all possible, will come back to these countries. So there's massive uncertainty in terms of employment and income for households. And what you see, and I think that's interesting to elaborate a little bit further upon, is that you could see that this pandemic will might trigger more drastic changes towards the global value chain and international cooperation, maybe leading in a rise to protectionism. Global trade will be different, I think, after this crisis. I'll get back to that a bit later. Just a few comments on the Dutch economy, because the interesting thing is that although our country is not very hard hit by the virus itself, unlike, for instance, Italy or Spain, we are taking major economic blows because our country is very dependent on the global economy. It's a very open, service-oriented economy. So we're very sensitive to a collapse in international trade. We don't produce a lot, but we facilitate trade, basically as a main port to Europe. And if Europe is buying less, then we are earning less. This is basically how simple it is. So after many years of economic expansion, we are going to contract. At least the economy is going to contract by about 6% this year, as they expect, which is the strongest decline since the war. Of course, here also we have a substantial government package of emergency measures. 2.5% of the Dutch GDP is being spent on support for businesses, trying to avoid structural damage to the economy. In general, I think, government is still functioning normally, albeit that the civil servants, like everybody else, is working from home as much as possible. That's still the instruction here. Stay at home unless you really need to go to work. All the government measures, they require extra manpower, but most institutions seem to cope. Applications for support packages, both for individual people, but also for businesses, are being dealt with rather efficiently, I think. The courts are still in operation, also under severe restrictions. All the requirements regarding social distancing and the limitation of the number of people allowed in the same room has an impact, of course, on hearings. Lots of hearings have been postponed. Urgent matters in family law issues and criminal cases are prioritized. And other cases are being dealt with either in writing, which was the case anyway in lots of civil cases in the Netherlands, or done via video conferencing. I had my first online injunction hearings in 22 years, so in my whole professional career last week, which is very interesting. Extreme flexibility, both from the courts, the court in Amsterdam, the president of the court who's presiding over injunction hearings, and also the parties, whereby the lawyers were in the Netherlands, but the litigating parties were in Singapore.
Clearly haven't been in the Netherlands.
In Germany and in Dubai. So everybody was in, like we are now, in a virtual courtroom. And I must say it worked brilliantly. So that was very interesting to do. Criminal cases obviously are taking a hit because there is a backlog of about, I think, 50,000 cases at the moment, because these kind of cases are not being dealt with, or dealt with more and more administratively at the moment. Maybe interesting as a firm, we're still very busy. We're operating on budget for the moment, which is good. Focus has shifted, obviously. M&A work, as you will understand, is down because deals are being put on hold. And of course, we have more employment work, insolvency work, and more in particular regarding the international trade work, which I do together with my team. We're facing obvious issues like determination and amendment of existing contracts for real reasons, but also for reasons which are a bit more convenient these days. And then the COVID situation is being used as an excuse to get out of a bad deal. Of course, with the well-established escapes of force majeure or unforeseen circumstances, I think most of our colleagues will have seen similar cases. And of course, everybody's trying, but the courts here in the Netherlands, at least, are very strict. And unless you have a very good reason, especially in B2B relationships, this negative economic situation is being regarded as part of your entrepreneurial risk. So that's too bad for you. Travel restrictions, of course, lead to difficulties of getting people on site for big construction and offshore work. So that's an issue. Of course, if these restrictions are government imposed travel bans, for instance, then that might be an excusable non-performance under the contract. So it depends very much on the case and the particular contract and how you explain it and how you translate the situation into possible remedies under the contract. We've seen logistical service providers faced with customers, businesses that cannot pay anymore because they can't generate income because their products are stuck in the warehouse or at the terminal. And then, of course, the interesting question is, what are you going to do? Are you going to chase your customers? Because the logistic service providers need the money too. On the other hand, you don't want to put your customers into bankruptcy or getting a bad relationship with them, because you might need that in a few months from now. So that's a very difficult, interesting balance to strike. The dropped oil prices create for some interesting business that creates opportunities for some and serious problems for others. And adding to that, perhaps most of you know that we have had some oil trader scandals in Singapore lately, and that has kept us off the streets the last few months. And as Yeli said, it's interesting. I mean, we see increased activity, of course, in the trade in PPE, in personal protective equipment. Obviously, there's a huge demand at the moment, and most European countries don't manufacture this material themselves. So it has to be imported from Asia, and then you run into the issues that our Chinese colleague has addressed before. I mean, is the product available in general? Does it really conform with all the specifications and regulations in Europe? So you have an issue with quality. There is a shortage still in logistics. Air freight now is sky high because the normal shipping lines don't operate as they usually do. There might be some unreliable suppliers in terms of projected volumes or quality or counterfeit products even. Prices are high, obviously, and there is the threat of trade restrictions, indeed, as addressed earlier as well, that might impact the movement of goods from certain countries. or getting finished products out of the country. I think it was last month or 2 months ago that we saw Philips, the electronics company from the Netherlands, getting in trouble in the US. It has manufacturing facilities in the US which produce ventilators, which were obviously in high demand in intensive care units, in hospitals. And the Trump administration threatened to use the Defense Production Act to try to prevent this medical equipment that Philips was producing in the US to go to Europe, so to prevent it from leaving the US and to force it to supply only to the American market. So that's an example of how European companies manufacture elsewhere products with all kinds of parts which come from all over the world, manufactured in Europe, but not destined for the US market, but for the European market. Well, and I think these things, as Yali addressed already, will change, and that businesses will have understood that maybe their supply chains are quite stretched at the moment, and that they're very dependent on manufacturing and on customers which are very far away. Let me see. Well, finally, maybe it's not interesting to know we don't have very active export restrictions in Europe. There is a specific European regulation dealing with restriction to the export of PPE from the European Union to third countries. Exactly is the same as in China, with lists of products that fall under the scope of this export ban. It's not a ban in itself. You need authorization from the local government. And basically the instruction from the European Union is we need to be careful because we need PPE ourselves. It's in very high demand and low supply. But on the other hand, the trade restrictions and the refusing applications should be used sparsely, because we do want to keep the economy open and to keep international trade flowing. These measures apply to exports from Europe to outside Europe. Interesting to know that for the purpose of intra-Europe, the UK is still regarded as a European country. The good thing about this COVID virus situation is that the whole Brexit issue is gone. Nobody's talking about it anymore. I know that in Brussels there are still very tough negotiations going on, but they're not getting anywhere. So it would not surprise me that it will be extended once more. Maybe a topic for another webinar. But the interesting thing is that an issue which made the news every day is now, somewhere on page 10 in the newspapers. So that's a bit the situation. I think it's interesting to join Yali's observations that the supply chain might need some rethinking. It might become shorter. Maybe businesses will want to be less dependent on their suppliers. They will look at exclusivity. Am I really going to attach my complete business to one manufacturer in Asia, or am I going to cover my back and maybe pay a little bit more, but to have additional manufacturing capacity in another country? Are my supply chains from a logistics point of view really, are they flexible enough? And I think by experiencing the restrictions and the impact of this worldwide crisis, a lot of businesses might consider trying to be more local, both in terms of getting their products and selling their products. So that will be interesting to see how that will develop from a business point of view, and also our role as lawyers in those developments, because it might require rethinking the contracts and reevaluating the situation under supply and purchase agreements as well. So that will be a very interesting development where we can play, I think an interesting role to assist our clients.
Great. Thanks for that. So that was interesting. It's interesting how similar the experiences are in China and Europe, and I'll talk about the US. There's a lot of the same considerations going on, particularly around trade controls and the supply chain. So just in terms of a general update on how things are going over here, courts are functioning. A lot of my understanding of the state courts, which I never enter professionally, are pretty much shut down for anything except for criminal cases and emergency cases. And this is my experience is excuse me, local to Illinois, but that's what I hear from people around the country. The federal courts are operating pretty well remotely, as Seb had experienced. So I know that the courts in which we practice trade law, the Court of International Trade, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, are hearing matters remotely via, mostly by audio only, but in some cases I understand they've done video hearings as well. So the reports I've heard back from people are that those are working well. I have not participated in one as of yet. The government agencies that are trade focused, so U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the International Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, are also all basically working with their staffs at home. Obviously, there are people who need to be out in the ports, for instance, to clear merchandise, but the headquarters people, policy people, are basically all working from home. There's been a number of presentations done recently by our bar association with folks from the agencies talking about how that's going, and they're making some accommodations for things that previously needed to be done on physical paper by mail, or similar things that required contact. There's been some ad hoc rules put in place, so that kind of thing seems to be working sort of apace. The general scenario on whether businesses are reopening, big businesses, manufacturing businesses, and small businesses, whether they're restaurants or law firms, is very much a local and state controlled situation. So like here in Illinois, we're moving toward slow reopening of businesses with limitations on the number of people that could be in the space. I got an email this morning. This refers back to the courts. I got an email this morning from the local federal courts saying that they're limiting the number of people and requiring face coverings within the buildings. So you're seeing businesses come back online. But in the bigger picture that we're talking about here, thinking about the trade in the current environment, it's hard to separate from in the U.S. at least, the impact of the COVID outbreak and all of the ramifications that had on supply chain from the bigger sort of disruption that the current administration has caused in trade. And that's not, I don't mean that in a mental sense, but there's been a lot of changes in trade regulation from 2016. So coming into office, the Trump administration immediately began discussions about pulling out of and renegotiating NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a tremendous amount of trade traveling in North America. There have been additional duties placed on merchandise of aluminum and steel products under a national security provision we call Section 232. There are duties on most products now coming from China under what we call Section 301, which has to do with U.S. efforts to force China to respect American intellectual property rights. By and large, that's the focus of that. And then the U.S. has expressed, I would say, its concerns about the way the appellate body works at the WTO, and has prevented the appointment of judges to the appellate body. So that has caused a tremendous amount of friction there as well. So all of that was happening before the virus outbreak. In January, it looked like things were moving in a good direction. There was the phase one deal. It's called the phase one deal with China, having to do with these 301 duties. And the U.S. agreed to basically pause any additional duties on Chinese goods in return for China agreeing to meet some purchasing targets. That, much like Brexit, has kind of fallen by the wayside because of everything else that's going on. I've seen, I would say, conflicting reports about whether China is going to be able to meet those obligations in the current environment. So all of that, and then when you put on the COVID outbreak and the economic consequences of that, I pulled some statistics from this. This comes from The Economist. So the UN Conference on Trade and Development is predicting a 30% drop in cross-border trade and foreign direct investment. The World Bank was expecting a 20% reduction in cross-border payments. Those are big numbers. And those are, if I remember this properly, it's 2021 period that they were talking about. So much of that is driven by lower demand, right? So if factories are not staffed up and people are not building cars or computers or refrigerators, then there's obviously lower demand for the input materials. But then also, of course, all the small businesses are working at reduced capacity and working all the way through the supply chain. That lower demand is having those consequences. So a couple of things that we can talk about that have come out of this. And as Sebastiaan mentioned, there's sort of a supply chain shock. People, and particularly the US government, have noted what is at least perceived to be a dangerous dependency on a limited number of suppliers, particularly suppliers in Asia and in China. This was evident early on in the US when we could not find an adequate supply of personal protective equipment, certain pharmaceutical primary ingredients, and the government has also issued new statements about the concern for semiconductor production. So, all of these things are products for which the U.S., the primary supplier to the U.S. is China, and the president, has specifically stated things like, why does anybody have a supply chain? He specifically said, why have a supply chain? You should just make everything. Which, of course, in the connected sort of global environment is a difficult thing to unwind, even if you believe it is the right thing to do. So in addition to those particular products, such as the PPE and the semiconductors, businesses who were doing manufacturing in the United States lost access to critical parts that supported their manufacturing operations. And that highlighted what Sebastiaan was talking about in terms of the concern about not having a diverse enough supply chain. It also meant for companies that were just, selling through, obviously, stores, malls, retail is largely shut down, but, people are doing what they can to sell through, whether it's e-commerce or elsewhere. They're also not necessarily getting goods. And part of that, as was mentioned, is the fact that there are a far fewer number of international flights happening. And you probably do know that air cargo travels in the belly of passenger planes as well as in dedicated cargo planes. So there's a far fewer flights that are happening, and therefore the price of air cargo has gone up. It's been much more difficult to get space on airplanes, although I did see recently that several airlines are retrofitting their passenger planes to carry cargo in the passenger area. So they're trying to ramp up capacity there. So but delivery times are extended, ships are filled when they're going because things are shifting from air cargo to sea. And keep in mind, the vast majority of international trade is by ocean and land, not by air. But just air highlights the difficulties here. So a couple of points I want to cover on particular trade issues. I mentioned the concern about PPE. We have been, during this whole thing, been very busy on our traditional customs, international trade, and export control work. But on top of that, just been getting a tremendous number of calls just over the transom, as they used to say, for people who are trying to bring PPE into the country. So there's been a lot of activity on that front. Most, not all, but most of these products are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration at one level or another. So surgical masks, as opposed to, so masks, gowns, thermometers, things that are designed and marketed to be used in a clinical setting are generally subject to FDA controls. Now, there's different levels of FDA controls depending on the category of the device. But what has happened over the course of the virus outbreak is the FDA has issued what are called emergency use authorizations, and then a larger sort of policy statement on enforcement discretion to make it easier to bring some of these products into the US, provided that there is not a substantial risk of harm to the public health and safety. So this has facilitated the importation of PPE, which is a good thing. Customs and Border Protection, which obviously is the border enforcement agency for the FDA, has pointed out a number of times that they've made seizures of substantial amounts of merchandise that does not meet the even the minimal requirements, or is just marked in a way that is either a counterfeit mark or is not consistent with other U.S. laws. So there's a big concern about products being marked with certification marks. So, for instance, we've all learned about N95 masks now. That is a standard. That standard mark, if it is applied to products that do not satisfy the N95 requirements, that is treated as a counterfeit product and will be seized by U.S. Customs. So there's been an uptick in that type of enforcement activity. In the longer term, in the broader term, I think that Seb and Ye are correct in that we're looking at a more diverse supply chain going forward. I've seen in print people talking about what they're calling China plus one, meaning you've got a supplier in China, it's maybe your main supplier, but you've got another supplier who is either actually producing product or able to produce that product. I personally do a lot of work for companies that are in the automotive sector, large product manufacturing. This is a difficult thing to do, to have a standby supplier or a secondary supplier, in part because of the expense of tooling and materials. It's difficult to get, if you need a plastic injection mold, for instance, they could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, or a die stamping for an automotive parts. So you don't want to tie a factory in the U.S. down because you can't get a stamped part. So the diverse, a more diverse supply chain. We've seen a lot of questions come up about Vietnam, about Thailand, about Taiwan, and I'd say more questions about Mexico than any place else. Now, Mexico is an interesting scenario because we also have coming on July 1st a new version of the North America Free Trade Agreement, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So in the midst of all of this COVID stuff and all the other trade work, companies in North America are scrambling to understand that agreement, how it differs from the prior agreement, and to implement compliance, because the word from the US government is that it is going to be July 1st. So people were hoping for a delay until January 1st, but that seems like that is not going to happen. Let's see, talk about diversified supply chain, the sort of friction in that having to do with tooling and long-term contracts, and also for infrastructure. So Vietnam, for instance, which is doing a tremendous amount of manufacturing, they're seeing a lot of textiles, toys, furniture coming out of Vietnam these days, but there are still limitations on general infrastructure. So, roads from factories to ports, port capacity, things like that. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. It's also one of the reasons why these days people are saying, Mexico, which is, from the US and Canada, obviously just a couple of hours away, possibly depending on where you are, the same time zone is just an easier way to operate if you can do it economically. So, all of that is happening. We do expect that, anytime we see an economic downturn of any kind, we do see the possibility of additional protective measures, either by the government or by private party actors. So from the government, there have been talk about additional national security duties. The statute that empowers the government to impose national security duties doesn't define, well, it broadly defines national security, and it's been interpreted to include economic security. So that gives the administration a lot of room to maneuver. There was a report done, which I don't think really ever became public, on whether automotive imports were a threat to national security. There was activity around uranium, and the most recent national security investigation has to do with a certain component that's used in large transformers that go into power grids. So it's possible we'll see more of that. It's also likely, I would say, that we will see more petitions brought by domestic producers for the imposition of anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. So these are petitions alleging that the price differential between the sales of similar products in the home market and in the U.S. market are sufficiently great that they're causing an injury to the U.S. Producers of the similar product, or that the foreign producing country is subsidizing the product in the U.S. and that subsidy is causing injury. So those cases tend to tick up anytime there is an economic downturn. You find industries that will, rightly try to get relief from the government. It is, just in case anybody's not familiar with this, what happens is that there's an offsetting duty that's collected. That duty goes to the Treasury. It doesn't go to the complaining party. So it's, but it does obviously affect the economics of importing that product. So just a couple of things to tick off here. Just one more thing I wanted to talk about with respect to Mexico. One of the things that we've seen, I've done a fair amount of work on in the last year, is to the extent that people are trying to diversify their supply chain, they're trying to do it in a way that limits the change in their manufacturing operation as much as possible. So what that likely means in a lot of cases is taking the materials that would have come into a factory in China and doing some portion of assembly or further processing in China, and then finishing a product outside of China, whether that's in Mexico or Vietnam or elsewhere. And just to the extent you may have clients who are in a situation like that, the US government has been issuing a lot of rulings. This comes from customs. They publicly issue rulings on the request of importers. They've been issuing a lot of rulings that are making it very difficult to determine exactly what level of additional work outside of China is required to change the country of origin. So, I worked on a case that's public. There's a ruling on it involving cable modems where the main printed circuit board was from China. It was sent to Mexico with all of the other necessary components, the power supply, the cabling, all the rest of it, assembled and programmed in Mexico. And, customs determined that the putting together the final unit in Mexico did not change the origin of the main component. So we ended up with a product that, according to customs, is appropriately labeled as made in Mexico or product of Mexico, but is subject to 301 duties, 25% duty on products of China at the same time. So these are obviously complicated and confusing scenarios. So to the extent that people may be hearing that, well, what we're going to do is finish this operation in another country, you really need to look hard at whether that finishing operation is more than simple assembly or simple combining. It has to be what the U.S. calls a substantial transformation into a new or different article of commerce. So that trying to diversify the supply chain, and which I see as the long-term effect of all of this, is maybe a little more complicated than people think. So should keep that in mind. And then there's obviously a related movement to, instead of nearshoring to Mexico, to reshoring production to the United States. Obviously that is the safest move if your only concern is having a sure supply chain that has no international trade friction in it. Obviously, it may not be economically as efficient as possible. So let me end there, and then I'll open up the opportunity to ask some questions of any of the three of us when we talk about these things. I personally would be interested to hear from folks who are participating who weren't speakers, if they've had any client-side experience or with these issues, and what your clients in various manufacturing and service industries are seeing. It'd be a great exchange on that. So.
Larry, unless someone else has a question. So this is a question kind of for Lee. So in the US, we don't really have our national government taking charge of like a PPE policy. So it's sort of like state by state, is like a fend for yourself type of deal. And in California, our governor somehow made some kind of deal that he announced with China to get special PPE in. So I was wondering how he did this, and whether that blacklist that you were talking about is absolute, and whether there are some exceptions to that, for just PPE or any products.
Hi, this is Yali. Yeah, it's a big news about the PPE supply. PPE contract between California and one of the largest manufacturer. We call it the BYD, and there is a large dispute about there is a regulation issue. I think finally the contract failed because of the regulation. It's like a $200 million US dollar PPE supply contract. So on the blacklist, the blacklist I would say the blacklist only designed for the PPE products and only for these various crises. It's not I would say it's not a list generally used. There is a similar blacklist, but mainly for domestic market, because normally the authority cares more about the order in the mass market for the interest of the consumers. That they have such kind of blacklist. But the blacklist here we are talking about is only for PPE, only for this virus crisis, and it is set up like emergently, and to remove the unqualified or bad behaved manufacturer or supplier for PPE. Yeah. Hope I addressed your question.
Yeah, no, that's very informative. I'm glad it's not creeping over to other products, just limited to PPEs.
Yeah, I could just add to that, Marcin. One thing is that there is no sort of federal procurement policy that's happening for the states and municipalities. I mean, there's this whole issue around that. So what I have read about, and I haven't had direct exposure to this, is the states like California, Indiana, I know Illinois had an issue with this as well. States are doing international procurement on their own for the first time. They don't usually have direct supply chains like that. And I know that in Illinois, the procurement rules almost never permit company or the government to pay in advance for merchandise, before they receive it. They always pay some point in time after, and in Illinois that can be a long time after. So Illinois did a payment upfront deal with a Chinese company for PPE as well. So there's a lot of scrambling, just like you're seeing in California.
Wow. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that out because you mentioned it. So airplanes, the pilots that used to fly international, or at least some of them, are now flying freight. So because they're not flying passengers, obviously. So that, I don't know if that will cut down on the cost of cargo at all. Well, at least you have people that will fly the planes, and the planes are then, are empty because they're not taking people, and they can't, frankly, in many countries don't even allow people to fly in around the world.
There's a similar issue looming with merchant marine trade. There are huge problems with getting crews changed. Typically, a U.S. merchant mariner would be on a ship no more than 120 days and usually a great deal less. And as we're sitting here, I got a daily newsletter that I get, and the lead story is ship crews stuck at sea are facing a humanitarian crisis because these guys, some that have, were already on for months and we're due for a crew change. And the places where the ships, the countries that the ship touches will not allow the crews to be changed out. And some of these merchant mariners have been on board for 200, 250 days and are just exhausted. And there's nothing, even diverting to another country would not help because no other country will allow the crew change either. That's another potential supply chain issue.
Mm. No, that's true, because we're talking about the sale of products, but also services and construction, for instance. All these offshore construction sites in the oil and gas business, or in offshore wind. Those have people on platforms and other kinds of support vessels, and they are on rotation normally. But it doesn't work, and if they come off in a strange country, wherever, then they have to be quarantined for 14 days, and only then they can go. And that has huge impact on the actual performance of the work. So it's a bad thing for the workers themselves, the people involved, but also for their employers, because they're running into all kinds of penalties, liquidated damages for being one day too late. Charters on vessels go astray because they've, in some of these vessels, the charter hire is in the tenth or sometimes even $100,000s of dollars per day, mind you. And if you cannot perform the work because you can't have the people, at least not as scheduled, you're running into big problems. So it's the free flow of work, of people, a free movement of people, I should say, is also a very very big issue at the moment.
Even new crews going on to the ship have to be quarantined for 2 weeks, because as soon as it hits a ship, it's like wildfire. The few times that it's happened has.
I think there's been a carrier in the U.S. Navy who encountered the problem.
But there have been a few merchant marine vessels as well. And, they can't even put into a port to get medical help. They can't, because the countries are not allowing them to evacuate the sick members.
Well, people can't get visas either to go to certain countries as well. As an immigration attorney, we're facing a lot of problems here without getting foreign talent and experts to come in, and scientists and researchers and high-tech professionals and even doctors come in to our country. And I'm sure that's the same in I don't know about in Europe, whether that's an issue or not. You have more of a free borders for people to travel to get, more of the.
Yeah, but still, even though there's free movement, now there's not. And some, this is now up to the individual countries. And for instance, I'm not allowed to go into Belgium right now unless I have a very good reason. I'm not allowed to travel through Germany unless I can show the reason why, and I can show some sort of pass whereby the authorities allow me to go through the country. And I think that's also a very interesting thing for us, because one thing is, of course, that we as lawyers are being confronted with the actual questions of our clients having issues now at the moment. And obviously we should try to help them. but also from a planning point of view. I mean, we talked about the supply chain changes because of, political circumstances, which started in the US, for instance, already a few years ago. Maybe COVID has accelerated those. But also, if you look at the contracting point of view, I mean, take the example of crew being necessary for certain projects. How do you translate that into your sales contract, into your services contract, into your construction contract? Because the old tools, in a way, if you look at the standard force majeure clauses, and if you look at the standard unforeseen circumstances clauses or fallback positions under a statute, it's not enough because it doesn't apply to these cases. And still, you want to protect your position. So you see that now we need to invent, basically, new rules and new parts of contracts. Because, mind you, this is one situation, and we're speaking about COVID-19, but COVID-25 or whatever version or permutation of this virus or similar circumstances could come up within a few years again. And the funny thing is that, for instance, these force majeure clauses, they're always like these boilerplate clauses. Everybody puts in their contract, and your clients do it themselves because nobody thinks about it. It's just a standard thing, and you put it in. And if there's a war or strikes or what have you, then you're covered. Well, now you're not. And it should make clients reconsider, and also as lawyers really reconsider and take a very good look at your contract and see, okay, this particular situation whereby there's a global event impacting everybody exactly at the same time in the same way. And now it's a virus, but it could also be something else, like climate change, for instance. We have serious issues to see how we should translate that into contracts, or the effects thereof, rather. That makes it very interesting and also very necessary, I think, for us in our role as lawyers, advising our clients on how to deal with that, because you see that the old school tools are not adequate enough to deal with the situation.
Deb, it's Arnie. I want to pick up on that because that was really just the thought I was having just listening to what is going on. And the question, I got a question and then sort of a separate proposal. The question is, are we at a transformational period? The discussions have been about how we're coping with the immediate, to some degree, unexpected crisis and how people are adjusting. But are we really at a transformational period where there will be a material rethinking of the global trade, global network, Larry's point, U.S. effort to bring things more in home, and I'm sure many countries are thinking about that. But at the same time, looking at transformations of court processes, your suggestion that people are dealing remotely with litigation. You have people in Dubai and in Singapore and elsewhere in hearings in the Netherlands, and things are working relatively smoothly. I think we may be transformationally at a point, not just with trade, but thinking about the whole legal services provision, and then thinking about INBLF and the assets that we have. And what I'm going to do at our next board meeting is have a discussion about assets that we have that we can bring to support others. And I was thinking, I think it was either in your discussion, the notion about the teaming assets that we have. When you look at trade, bringing in, food and drug experts, bringing in licensing experts within the network, and making propositions to clients to support a new kind of legal services that are based locally, but bring in the international assets that we have. And I don't have answers for it yet, but part of it may relate to the practice group setup that we have nascent in the organization that's really not been employed effectively. But I'm thinking that the trade group should have more conversations, put aside this webinar for the larger network. You should have conversations to support each other. And there may be other others that can be brought into the discussions in licensing and food and drug, in other commercial things on a global basis, that we can provide assets for our clients and improve our own service. But generally, I mean, the larger question is, are we at a transformational stage now where we have to begin to seriously rethink, the kinds of legal services that we will be providing to our clients, not just immediately dealing with this crisis, but going forward, and thinking creatively.
It's an interesting proposition. It's an interesting question. Obviously, it's hard to tell what'll happen. I want to talk about manufacturing for a second, then we'll talk about legal services. But this could very well be a transformational moment in supply chains and manufacturing, whether that's services or physical manufacturing, because of all of these dependencies that people are realizing are not secure in the event that there's any kind of a risk in the supply chain. I think that companies that are sophisticated with respect to this sort of issue will take on some of these as challenges and redesign the way they're doing their business. This is the China plus one model is something that I've seen. The reshoring of manufacturing is happening, and there's a lot of push to do that. Question as to whether that satisfies some of the governmental interest in job creation, because what's happening in a lot of manufacturing is automation, and with the additive manufacturing or 3D printing, lots of things, not necessarily generating new jobs, although they are doing manufacturing. I do have a concern that if, depending on how long this all takes and when we get back to something resembling a normal trade environment, whether the purchasing and logistics folks might fall back onto bad habits, right, or old habits, right? The easy thing to do now, if you're a company that has a global supply chain, is to find a high quality and low cost supplier in China. It's just it's the way you do things. And if we come through this quickly, there hasn't been a change in the mindset of some of the, these are important people in companies who do important works, but I'm going to say sort of the middle management type people who are making the actual purchasing decisions. Those folks could very easily fall back to the same suppliers, the same chains that they had, the same people they've been doing business with, and we could end up back in exactly the same place. I don't think that'll be universally true. I think the larger sophisticated companies, and I think that people who are coming up and learning the business now will take this to heart. So we'll see. I think you're going to have a mixture of results.
But it will depend, Larry, I think, on how long it will take. Don't you agree?
Yes, it depends. I think that is
because if we rebound quite quickly, then I think it will be business as usual for everybody. We'll be in the plane as much as we were. People will do exactly the same. Of course, here and there will be some changes, but I don't think there will be dramatic transformations. But the longer it takes, I think the more urgency there is, and the more sustainable and the changes will be. I think it will very much depend on how long all this will take.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I think that's exactly right.
Hey, Seb, I think we are in for a longer haul. I mean, that's my personal.
I think that's probably true, and I think that'll impact how this goes. I think, Arnie, with respect to the provision of legal services, I think we're much more likely to see a fundamental shift. Although I don't know among INBLF size law firms and our membership, because I think that we tend to be on the relatively smaller side, at least in North America, and more nimble than the big firms. But I've seen a number of articles about how big firms are, suddenly realizing that their opulent office space is not productive in terms of generating revenue, that their requirements to have people physically in their office space, that giant sized corner partner offices are not revenue producing. There was just a piece in Law 360 about the New York market for legal real estate, and it's being substantially rethought. And I think firms that are our size, that are already nimble enough to be using all this remote technology that we're using today, using cloud services, having flexibility with respect to where people are. I think that's going to spread to larger firms that have been resistant. But I think we're ahead of the game, a lot of us, on those things now, and I think that's good, and it creates an opportunity for us to work together in ways that a bigger firm might not be able to do as easily as we can do. Ye Li and I I recently referred a potential Chinese tax matter to him. I've worked with folks around the world on INBLF matters, so we can do that, and putting a formal structure around it, is a worthwhile effort.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Seb and Yuzi. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I think we've kept everyone long enough, although it was so interesting. We'd probably keep going more hours, but I think we should probably.
Well, Ye Li has to go to bed. It's midnight, right? So.
Thank you for consideration. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
For joining us.
Thank you. It was very interesting.